Welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep, where the open road leads to destinations you never intended to reach. Tonight we're buckling up for 5 true stories from travelers who discovered that some journeys take you places that don't exist on any map. Some rest stops serve customers who should no longer be hungry. And some roads never actually lead you home. Turn off your lights, settle in for the drive. And join me as we explore 5 bone-chilling true road trip horror stories that will make you never want to drive long distance again. Story 1. The Midnight Passenger. Jake Morrison was driving from Chicago to Denver, a 900-mile journey he'd made dozens of times for work. As a pharmaceutical sales rep, Jake was accustomed to long drives across the Midwest, and he'd developed a system that allowed him to make the trip efficiently while staying alert and safe. He always left Chicago around 6 p.m. on Friday, drove until around midnight, found a motel somewhere in western Iowa or eastern Nebraska, slept for 6 hours, and completed the drive to Denver by early afternoon Saturday. It was a routine that worked well, allowing him to attend Monday morning meetings while maintaining a reasonable work-life balance. On the night of March 15th, Jake was making this familiar journey when he encountered a passenger who challenged everything he thought he knew about traveling alone. Jake had left Chicago right on schedule, and the drive through Illinois and Iowa had been routine. Good weather, light traffic, clear roads, everything was going according to plan. He was listening to a podcast about true crime, staying alert with coffee and energy drinks, and making good time toward his planned overnight stop in Nebraska. It was around 11:30 p.m. when Jake decided to pick up a hitchhiker. Jake had a strict policy against picking up strangers, but this situation seemed different. The hitchhiker was a well-dressed woman in her 30s, standing beside a disabled car on the shoulder of Interstate 80. Her hazard lights were flashing, and she appeared to be stranded with mechanical problems rather than simply looking for a ride. Jake pulled over and rolled down his passenger window. The woman approached his car with a relieved expression. "Thank God," she said. "My car just died and my cell phone has no signal out here. Could you possibly give me a ride to the next town? I just need to get somewhere I can call for help." The woman was articulate, professionally dressed, and seemed genuinely distressed about her situation. Jake's instincts told him she was legitimate, not a criminal or con artist, just someone having car trouble in the middle of nowhere. "Sure, hop in," Jake said. "I'm heading toward Grand Island. Will that work?" "That would be perfect. Thank you so much." The woman got into Jake's car, and they resumed driving west on Interstate 80. She introduced herself as Sarah and explained that she was a nurse traveling home to Colorado after visiting family in Iowa. Her story was detailed and consistent. She described her sister's house in Cedar Rapids, the family gathering she had attended, her work at a hospital in Denver, her planned arrival time at home. Jake felt comfortable with his decision to help her. Sarah seemed genuinely grateful for the assistance and didn't display any of the warning signs that safety experts advise drivers to watch for when considering whether to help stranded motorists. She was articulate, well-dressed, and her emotional responses to her situation seemed authentic. They talked for about 30 minutes about travel, work, and the challenges of long-distance driving. Sarah was intelligent and engaging, sharing stories about her experiences as a traveling nurse, the patients she had helped, and the satisfaction she found in medical work. Jake found himself enjoying the company after several hours of driving alone. Sarah seemed familiar with the route and mentioned landmarks and towns that Jake recognized from his regular trips. She knew about the best truck stops, the locations where cell phone coverage was spotty, and the stretches of highway where speed traps were common. Her knowledge of the route suggested that she had made this journey many times, which supported her story about being a nurse who traveled between Iowa and Colorado regularly. Jake noticed that Sarah had a calming presence that made the long drive more pleasant. Her conversation was interesting without being distracting, and she seemed to understand the rhythm of long-distance driving, when to talk and when to let the driver concentrate on the road. She offered to help with navigation, volunteered to stay awake to help Jake remain alert, and generally seemed like an ideal passenger for a solo road trip. That it was around midnight when Jake noticed something odd about Sarah's reflection in his rearview mirror. When Jake looked directly at Sarah, she appeared completely normal, well-dressed, alert, engaged in conversation. But when he glanced at her reflection in the mirror, something was wrong. Her reflection seemed faded, almost transparent, and her features appeared distorted. Jake assumed he was experiencing fatigue-related vision problems. He'd been driving for 6 hours, and it wasn't uncommon for tired drivers to experience visual distortions. He made a mental note to find a motel soon and continued the conversation with Sarah. But the reflection issue persisted. Every time Jake looked in his mirrors, Sarah's reflection appeared increasingly strange, sometimes barely visible, sometimes showing a completely different person, sometimes absent entirely, even though Sarah was clearly sitting in the passenger seat. "Sarah," Jake said carefully, "are you feeling okay? You look a little pale." Sarah smiled. "I'm fine, just tired from the long day. Thanks for asking." Jake looked directly at Sarah. She appeared healthy and normal. But when he checked his rearview mirror again, there was no reflection at all. The passenger seat appeared empty in the mirror, even though Sarah was clearly sitting there. Jake began to feel uneasy. He'd heard stories about optical illusions and hallucinations that could affect tired drivers, but this situation felt different. The inconsistency between what he saw directly and what appeared in his mirrors was too pronounced to be explained by simple fatigue. "Sarah, where exactly in Colorado are you headed?" "Denver," she replied. "I live in a suburb called Lakewood." "Do you know it?" Jake knew Lakewood well. It was close to his own destination. "Yes, I'm actually going to Denver too. I could drive you all the way if you'd like." Sarah's expression changed subtly. Her friendly demeanor became more intense, almost predatory. "That would be wonderful. Jake, I'd really appreciate the company for the entire trip." Something about the way Sarah said "company" made Jake's blood run cold. Her tone had shifted from grateful to possessive, as if she had no intention of ever leaving his car. Jake decided to test something. "Sarah, can you hand me that water bottle from the cup holder?" Sarah reached toward the cup holder, but her hand passed through the water bottle without affecting it. She seemed unaware that her hand had no physical substance. "I'm sorry, I can't seem to grab it," Sarah said casually. "My hands are really cold. Could you get it yourself?" Jake reached for the water bottle. It was exactly where it had been. Sarah's hand had passed through it completely, as if she weren't physically present in the car. Jake's heart began racing. He was driving down a dark interstate highway at midnight with a passenger who cast no reflection and couldn't interact with physical objects. But when he looked directly at Sarah, she appeared completely solid and real. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. When did your car break down?" "About an hour ago," Sarah replied. "Just before you came along?" ***. What kind of car was it?" Sarah's expression became confused. "Car? I'm not sure. I think it was blue." "What were you doing in Iowa?" "Visiting family, my sister." Sarah's voice was becoming less certain. "What's your sister's name?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I don't remember." Jake realized that Sarah was becoming less coherent as he asked specific questions about her background. Her story was falling apart, and she seemed to be losing the ability to maintain her cover story. "Sarah, what's the last thing you remember clearly?" Sarah stared ahead at the highway for several minutes before answering. When she spoke, her voice was different, softer, more confused. "I was driving home from Iowa. It was snowing. No raining. There was another car. Headlights coming toward me. I tried to turn the wheel, but Sarah's voice trailed off, and Jake saw tears forming in her eyes. "Sarah, what year is it?" 1987, she said without hesitation. Jake felt his stomach drop. It was 2023. Sarah was describing events that had occurred 36 years ago. "Sarah, I think there's something you need to understand. It's 2023. You were in an accident a long time ago." Sarah turned to look directly at Jake, and for the first time, he could see that her appearance was changing. Her clothing looked dated, her hairstyle was from a different era, and her face had the pale, ethereal quality of someone who was no longer among the living. "I was going home," Sarah said, her voice now barely a whisper. "I just wanted to get home to my family." "I know," Jake said gently. "But Sarah, you can't come with me to Denver. You need to go to wherever home really is for you now." Sarah began to fade before Jake's eyes. Her physical presence became increasingly transparent until she was barely visible in the passenger seat. "Will you tell them I was trying to come home?" Sarah asked as she continued to fade. "I will," Jake promised. Sarah smiled sadly, and then she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and Jake was alone in his car again. Jake pulled over at the next rest stop and spent an hour researching traffic. Accidents on Interstate 80 between Iowa and Nebraska in 1987. He found a news article about Sarah Michelle Patterson, a 32-year-old nurse who had died in a head-on collision during a snowstorm while driving home to Colorado after visiting her sister in Iowa. According to the article, Sarah had been making the same journey Jake was making from Iowa to Denver via Interstate 80. She had died at the scene of the accident, and her family had always regretted that she died alone on the highway. Trying to get home, Jake completed his drive to Denver, but he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and her desperate need to finish her journey home. He researched her family and discovered that her parents and siblings had all passed away in the decades since her death. Sarah had been wandering Interstate 80 for 36 years, looking for someone to help her complete her final trip home. Jake began reaching out to other drivers who regularly traveled Interstate 80, asking discreetly about unusual encounters. He found a surprising number of people who had similar experiences: hitchhikers who disappeared, passengers who cast no reflections, travelers who seemed to be from different time periods. Through online forums and truck driver networks, Jake discovered that Interstate 80 was known among professional drivers as a ghost highway, a route where encounters with deceased travelers were relatively common, particularly during overnight hours. Many drivers had developed personal protocols for handling these encounters, treating them with respect while maintaining their focus on completing their own journeys safely. Jake learned that Sarah was just one of many travelers who had died along Interstate 80 over the decades. The highway's role as a major cross-country route meant that countless people had made their final journeys along this road, and some of them apparently continued trying to reach their destinations long after their deaths. Jake also discovered that other phantom hitchhikers had been reported along Interstate 80, a World War II veteran trying to get home from the Pacific Theater, a young mother attempting to reach her children after dying in an accident, an elderly man seeking to visit his wife's grave before his own death. Each of these travelers had died while making important journeys, and each continued seeking help from living drivers to complete their trips. On subsequent trips between Chicago and Denver, Jake always drove that stretch of Interstate 80 with extra awareness. He never encountered Sarah again, but he began to see other signs of phantom travelers, shadows in his peripheral vision, voices on the radio that seemed to be calling for help, headlights in his mirrors that disappeared when he looked directly at them. Jake came to understand that highways serve as more than transportation networks. They are pathways for human hopes and dreams, routes along which people travel toward the most important destinations in their lives. When those journeys are interrupted by death, the desire to complete them can be so strong that it transcends physical limitations. Interstate 80, stretching from New York to California, represents one of the most significant transportation arteries in American history. Millions of people have traveled this route seeking new opportunities, returning home to family, pursuing dreams, or fleeing from problems. The collective emotional energy of all these journeys has created a corridor where the boundary between life and death becomes permeable, allowing determined travelers to continue seeking help long after their earthly journeys should have ended. Story 2: The Endless Highway. Maria Santos and her boyfriend, Carlos, were driving from Los Angeles to Phoenix for a weekend wedding. The 370-mile trip should have taken about 5.5 hours, but they had left early Friday afternoon to avoid traffic and planned to arrive in Phoenix with time to relax before the wedding. Activities began. Maria had made this drive several times over the years to visit family, and she was familiar with the route, Interstate 10 east through the California desert, past Palm Springs, through the Colorado River Valley, and into Arizona. It was a straightforward journey across mostly empty desert landscape. Carlos was driving while Maria navigated and managed the music playlist. They were in good spirits, looking forward to the wedding and enjoying the desert scenery. The weather was perfect, traffic was light, and they were making excellent time. It was around 6 p.m. when they entered what appeared to be the longest stretch of desert highway either of them had ever experienced. They had been driving for about 3 hours and should have been approaching the California-Arizona border. Maria was expecting to see signs for Blythe, California, and the Colorado River, but instead they found themselves on a section of Interstate 10 that seemed to stretch endlessly into the desert. "How long have we been on this straight section?" Carlos asked. Maria checked her phone's GPS. "According to this, we should have reached Blythe an hour ago, but I don't see any signs for it." They continued driving, expecting to see familiar landmarks, but the highway remained exactly the same, a perfectly straight road through empty desert, with no towns, no exit ramps, no signs of civilization. The sun was setting, but it seemed to remain fixed in the same position in the sky, casting long shadows that never changed. Maria began to feel uneasy about their situation. She had driven this route multiple times and was familiar with every major landmark between Los Angeles and Phoenix. The stretch of Interstate 10 they were currently on should have included several small towns, at least 3 major truck stops, multiple exit ramps for local roads, and various geographical features like mountain ranges and river valleys. But the landscape around them was completely featureless, flat desert extending to the horizon in all directions, with no variation in elevation, no distinctive rock formations, and no mountains visible in any direction. The desert vegetation was sparse and uniform, consisting only of scattered Joshua trees and low scrub brush that seemed to repeat in identical patterns. Carlos was also becoming concerned about their situation. As an experienced driver who had made numerous trips across the American Southwest, he understood the normal rhythm of desert highway travel. Even the most remote stretches of interstate included periodic services, exit ramps, and geographical landmarks that helped travelers gauge their progress and maintain their bearings. The highway itself seemed too perfect to be real. The pavement was absolutely smooth, with no potholes, no repairs, no signs of wear from weather or traffic. The lane markings were perfectly painted, the guardrails showed no damage, and the road shoulders were completely clean with no debris or evidence that other vehicles had ever pulled over. Most disturbing was the complete absence of other traffic. Interstate 10 was one of the major transcontinental highways in the United States, carrying thousands of vehicles daily between Los Angeles and Phoenix. Even during off-peak hours, travelers should have encountered truck drivers, commuters, and other long-distance travelers making the same journey. "Maria, look at the odometer," How many miles have we driven since we left LA? Maria checked the dashboard. The odometer showed that they had driven 180 miles since leaving Los Angeles, which should have placed them well into Arizona. But when she consulted her phone's GPS, the device showed their location as somewhere in the California desert, still at least 100 miles from the Arizona border. More disturbing, the GPS was providing increasingly inaccurate information. The estimated arrival time in Phoenix was constantly increasing rather than decreasing, despite the fact that they were maintaining highway speed and hadn't made any stops. According to the GPS calculations, they were somehow moving farther from their destination, even though they were driving directly toward it. Carlos tried adjusting their speed to see if this would affect their progress through the landscape. He slowed down to 45 miles per hour, then increased to 80 miles per hour. But the terrain around them remained exactly the same regardless of their speed. They seemed to be driving through a landscape that existed independent of their motion through it. "This doesn't make sense," Maria said. "We've been driving east for hours, but the GPS thinks we're still in the same place." Carlos pointed ahead at the highway. "Look at this road. Does it seem familiar to you?" Maria studied the landscape around them. The highway was perfectly straight, with no curves or hills. The desert on both sides was completely flat, with scattered Joshua trees and scrub brush. There were no mountains visible in any direction, which was wrong. They should have been seeing mountain ranges throughout this part of the journey. Most disturbing, the highway itself looked too perfect. The pavement was flawlessly smooth, with perfectly painted lane markings and no signs of wear or repair. There was no road debris, no skid marks, no evidence that other vehicles had ever used this stretch of highway. "Carlos, when's the last time we saw another car?" Carlos thought for a moment. "I don't remember seeing any other traffic since we entered this desert section." They had been driving for over an hour without seeing a single other vehicle. On Interstate 10, one of the major cross-country highways, this was virtually impossible even in the most remote desert areas. "Let's take the next exit," Maria suggested. "We can get our bearings and figure out where we are." They drove for another 30 minutes, watching for exit ramps, but none appeared. The highway continued in a perfect straight line with no exits, no access roads, no signs indicating nearby towns or services. Carlos tried adjusting their speed, slowing down to 45 miles per hour and then increasing to 80 miles per hour. But the landscape around them remained exactly the same. They passed the same Joshua trees, the same rock formations, the same distant hills that never seemed to get closer or farther away. "Maria, I think we're driving in a loop somehow. That Joshua tree with the twisted branches, I swear we've passed it 3 times. Maria had been having the same thought. Despite driving in a straight line for hours, certain landmarks in the desert seemed to repeat every 20 or 30 minutes, as if they were traveling in a circle rather than progressing east toward Arizona. She tried calling 911 on her cell phone, but discovered that she had no signal despite being in an area where she'd always had coverage on previous trips. Carlos's phone showed the same problem. No signal, no data connection, no way to contact anyone outside their car. "What time is it?" Carlos asked. Maria checked her phone. 7:15 p.m. But look at the sun. It's still in the same position it was an hour ago. The sun remained fixed in the western sky, neither setting nor moving across the horizon. The lighting around them had an odd quality, as if they were driving through a photograph rather than a real landscape. Carlos decided to try an experiment. He pulled over to the side of the highway and turned off the engine. They got out of the car to examine their surroundings more closely. The desert was completely silent. No wind, no bird sounds, no distant traffic noise. The silence was so complete that they could hear their own heartbeats and breathing. The air smelled of nothing, no desert vegetation, no car exhaust, no dust. It was as if they were standing in a vacuum. Most disturbing, when they looked back at the highway behind them, it appeared to fade into a hazy distance, as if the road they had just traveled was disappearing from reality. Looking ahead, the highway extended into the distance, but it seemed to have no definitive endpoint. "Maria, look at our car." Their car appeared normal from most angles, but when they walked around to view it from behind, it cast no shadow despite the bright sunlight. The car itself was real and solid, but it seemed to exist without interacting normally with the environment around it. They got back in the car and resumed driving, but now they were both actively frightened. This wasn't a navigation error or mechanical problem. They had somehow entered a version of Interstate 10 that existed outside normal reality. "Carlos, what if we turn around and go back the way we came?" Carlos executed a U-turn in the median and began driving west, back toward California. But the landscape ahead of them looked exactly the same as the landscape they had been driving through while heading east. The highway was identical in both directions, and the same landmarks appeared to repeat regardless of which direction they traveled. They drove west for an hour, then turned around and drove east again. The experience was exactly the same, an endless, perfect highway through unchanging desert landscape with no other traffic, no exits, and no signs of approaching their destination. Maria began to panic. "Carlos, we're trapped here. This highway doesn't actually go anywhere. There has to be an explanation. Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere and we're on a road that's not on the GPS." But they both knew this was impossible. They had been driving on Interstate 10, a major highway, and hadn't taken any exits or alternate routes. They had somehow transitioned from normal highway travel to this endless desert road without any awareness of when or how the change had occurred. As darkness approached, the highway became even more surreal. Street lights appeared along the roadway, but they illuminated nothing. The light seemed to be absorbed by the desert rather than reflecting off the landscape. The road ahead remained visible, but it had an ethereal quality, as if they were driving through a dream. "Maria, look at the fuel gauge." Despite driving for hours, their fuel gauge hadn't moved. The tank showed exactly the same level as when they had entered the endless highway section. They were consuming no fuel, experiencing no mechanical wear, existing in a state of suspended motion that defied physical laws. Around what should have been 10 p.m., they encountered something that changed everything. Ahead on the highway, they saw headlights, another vehicle traveling in their direction. Carlos flashed his high beams and honked his horn, desperate to communicate with other travelers who might help them understand their situation. As the vehicle approached, Maria could see that it was an older sedan with 2 occupants. The car passed them going in the opposite direction, but as it did, Maria got a clear look at the driver. The driver was Carlos. "Carlos, that was you driving that car." "That's impossible. I'm right here. It was you, and I was in the passenger seat. We just passed ourselves." Carlos immediately turned around to follow the other car, but when they completed the U-turn, the highway behind them was empty. The other vehicle had vanished, leaving no trace of its existence. But now they understood something horrifying. They were not just trapped on an endless highway. They were trapped in a loop of their own journey. The other car had contained versions of themselves, probably experiencing the same confusion and fear they were feeling. Over the next several hours, they encountered the other car multiple times. Sometimes it was ahead of them, sometimes behind them, sometimes passing in the opposite direction. Each time, they could see themselves inside the other vehicle, apparently unaware of their duplicate selves. Traveling the same endless highway, Maria came to understand that they had somehow become trapped in a recursive version of their journey, doomed to repeat the same stretch of highway forever, occasionally encountering other iterations of themselves, making the same futile trip. The only thing that broke the loop was dawn. As the first light of sunrise appeared in the east, the endless highway began to change. Exit ramps appeared, road signs became visible, and the landscape transformed from the featureless desert into the familiar terrain of the Colorado River Valley. Suddenly, they were driving through Blythe, California, approaching the Arizona border, exactly where they should have been hours earlier. Their GPS showed their correct location, their cell phones regained signal, and other traffic appeared on the highway around them. Carlos immediately took the first exit and found a gas station. When they checked the time, it was 6:30 a.m. Saturday morning. They had lost an entire night to the endless highway. But somehow they had also gained time, arriving at their destination earlier than should have been possible given when they had left Los Angeles. Maria and Carlos completed their drive to Phoenix, attended the wedding, and never spoke publicly about their experience on the endless highway. But they both understood that certain stretches of road exist outside normal reality, and that some journeys take travelers through dimensions that parallel, but don't quite intersect with the world as we know it. Maria began researching similar experiences online and discovered that Interstate 10 through the California and Arizona desert had a history of unusual encounters. Other drivers had reported becoming lost on endless stretches of highway that seemed to exist outside normal geography, experiencing time distortions, and encountering duplicate versions of themselves traveling the same impossible routes. The phenomenon seemed to be most common during evening and overnight hours, particularly when drivers were traveling alone or in small groups. The psychological stress of long-distance desert driving, combined with the isolated and repetitive landscape, appeared to create conditions where reality became unstable. Carlos started carrying additional navigation equipment on long trips: paper maps, compass, emergency beacon, anything that might help them maintain their bearings if they encountered another temporal anomaly. He also researched the geology and history of the desert areas along their route, looking for clues about what might cause such dramatic distortions in space and time. Maria discovered that the Mojave Desert had a long history of mysterious disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and encounters with impossible landscapes. Native American traditions spoke of spirit roads that led to other worlds, and early Spanish explorers had reported traveling for days through desert terrain that seemed to exist outside normal geography. The couple began planning their future trips more carefully, always traveling during daylight hours and taking regular breaks to maintain their connection to normal reality. They also established communication protocols with family members, checking in at regular intervals to ensure that their journeys progressed normally. Maria and Carlos never encountered the endless highway again, but they remained aware that certain roads seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The desert highways of the American Southwest serve as boundaries between the known and unknown, places where the normal rules of geography and time don't always apply. They came to understand that Interstate 10, as one of the major transcontinental highways, carries more than just traffic between cities. It carries the hopes, fears, and dreams of millions of travelers, creating corridors of intense human emotion that can occasionally break through into alternate realities. The endless highway they experienced represented a version of travel anxiety made manifest, the fear that a journey might never end, that a road might lead nowhere, that travelers might become trapped in an eternal loop of motion without progress. Their experience served as a reminder that travel requires not just mechanical preparation, but psychological readiness for encounters with the impossible. Story 3: The Family Diner. Tom Richardson was driving from Seattle to his parents' house in rural Oregon, a journey he made several times a year. The 5-hour drive took him through some of the most beautiful landscape in the Pacific Northwest, but it also included long stretches through remote forested areas where Services were sparse, and cell phone coverage was unreliable. Tom had made this drive dozens of times over the years and was familiar with the route. He knew where to stop for gas, which rest areas had clean bathrooms, and how to time his brakes to avoid getting drowsy during the more monotonous sections of the journey. On the evening of October 12th, Tom stopped for dinner at a family restaurant that challenged everything he thought he knew about rural dining and the nature of reality itself. Tom had been driving for about 3 hours and was feeling hungry as he approached the halfway point of his journey. He was looking for a place to stop for dinner, preferably something more substantial than fast food, but not so elaborate that it would significantly delay his arrival at his parents' house. As Tom crested a hill on Highway 20, he saw exactly what he was looking for: a classic roadside diner with a large parking lot and a sign that read, "Murphy's Family Restaurant, home cooking since 1952. The building looked exactly like diners from the 1950s, with chrome siding, large windows, and neon signs advertising fresh pie and coffee. Tom pulled into the parking lot, which was about half full with a mix of cars, pickup trucks, and one large semi-truck. The diner appeared to be popular with locals and travelers, which Tom took as a good sign for food quality. As Tom approached the entrance, he noticed that the diner had an unusually authentic 1950s appearance. Not just the exterior architecture, but the cars in the parking lot, the clothing worn by people he could see through the windows, and even the style of the neon signage seemed to be genuinely from that era rather than modern reproductions. Tom entered the diner and was greeted by a hostess wearing a classic 1950s waitress uniform, pink dress, white apron, hairstyled in a perfect bouffant. The interior of the diner was immaculately maintained, with red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and a long counter with chrome stools. "Welcome to Murphy's," the hostess said with a warm smile. "Table for one?" "Yes, please." The hostess led Tom to a booth near the window and handed him a menu. Tom looked around the diner and noticed that all the other customers appeared to be dressed in 1950s clothing. The men wore suits or work clothes typical of that era, and the women wore dresses, cardigans, and hairstyles that seemed authentic rather than costume-like. Tom assumed he had stumbled upon some kind of theme restaurant or perhaps a community where people enjoyed dressing in vintage clothing. The Pacific Northwest was known for quirky local establishments, and Tom appreciated the attention to detail in creating an authentic 1950s atmosphere. A waitress approached Tom's table. She was a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of customer service demeanor that seemed genuinely from an earlier era: friendly, efficient, and professional without being overly familiar. "Good evening, honey. What can I get you to drink?" Tom ordered coffee and began studying the menu. The prices were astonishingly low: a full dinner with meat, vegetables, and dessert for $2.75. Tom assumed these were novelty prices meant to enhance the 1950s theme. "Miss, these prices seem unusually low. Is this some kind of special promotion?" The waitress looked confused. "Those are our regular prices. Is there something wrong?" Tom decided not to pursue the question. "No, everything looks fine. I'll have the meatloaf dinner with mashed potatoes and green beans." "Excellent choice. That comes with bread, butter, and your choice of pie for dessert." As Tom waited for his food, he observed the other customers more closely. Their conversations, mannerisms, and even their topics of discussion seemed authentically from the 1950s. He overheard discussions about current events and cultural references that would have been relevant 60 years ago but made no sense in the context of 2023. One couple was discussing their excitement about seeing a new movie starring Clark Gable. A group of men at the counter were talking about baseball games and players from the 1950s as if they were current events. A family with 2 children was planning a vacation that involved driving to destinations that Tom knew had been dramatically changed or destroyed decades ago. Tom's food arrived, and it was excellent, clearly homemade, generously portioned, and prepared in the style of traditional American comfort food. The meatloaf was tender and flavorful, the mashed potatoes were creamy and rich, and the green beans were fresh and perfectly seasoned. The bread was warm and homemade, served with real butter, and the coffee was strong and freshly brewed. But as he ate, he became increasingly aware that something was fundamentally wrong with his situation. The food was too perfect, too authentic to be recreated by a modern restaurant. The flavors, textures, and preparation methods seemed to be genuinely from the 1950s, as if the meals were being prepared by cooks who had learned their techniques during that era. The service was also exceptionally authentic. The waitress checked on Tom regularly without being intrusive, refilled his coffee cup promptly, and maintained the kind of professional but friendly demeanor that characterized customer service from an earlier era. Her mannerisms, speech patterns, and approach to hospitality seemed completely natural rather than performed. Tom observed the kitchen area through a service window and could see cooks working with equipment that appeared to be from the 1950s. The stoves, refrigerators, and food preparation tools were vintage models, but they seemed to be in regular use rather than museum pieces or props for a theme restaurant. The other customers in the diner continued their conversations, and Tom began listening more carefully to their discussions. They weren't just dressed like people from the 1950s. They were talking about events, concerns, and cultural references that were specific to that time period. A group of men at the counter were discussing the Korean War as a current event, sharing concerns about family members who were serving overseas. A young couple in a nearby booth were planning their wedding and talking about honeymoon destinations that reflected 1950s travel options. An elderly woman was reading a newspaper that appeared to contain genuine news from 1952. The topics of conversation weren't just historically accurate, they reflected the genuine concerns, interests, and perspectives of people living through that time period. The customers seemed to be experiencing 1952 as their present reality, rather than recreating it as a nostalgic fantasy. More disturbing, when Tom looked out the window at the parking lot, the cars he could see were all from the 1940s and 1950s, classic models in excellent condition, but clearly not modern reproductions or collector vehicles. They appeared to be ordinary cars owned by ordinary people from that era. Tom checked his cell phone and discovered that he had no signal, which wasn't unusual in this rural area. But when he looked at his phone's clock, it displayed a date in October 1952. Tom's heart began racing. He tried to rationalize what he was experiencing. Perhaps his phone had malfunctioned. Perhaps this was an elaborate historical reenactment. Perhaps he was dreaming or experiencing some kind of breakdown. But when he looked around the diner again, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Every person in the restaurant was staring at him out openly. But when Tom made eye contact with other customers, they quickly looked away, as if they had been observing him and didn't want to be caught. The conversations continued, but Tom could sense that he had become the subject of intense but discreet attention. The waitress returned to Tom's table. "How's everything, honey?" "Fine, thank you. Can I ask you something? What year is it?" The waitress looked at Tom with concern. "It's 1952, honey. Are you feeling all right? You look a little confused." Tom stared at the waitress. She appeared genuinely puzzled by his question, as if asking about the year was the most natural thing in the world, but his confusion about the answer was cause for concern. "I'm sorry. I think I'm more tired from driving than I realized. Could I get my check, please?" "Of course, honey." The waitress brought Tom's check, and the total was $2.75, exactly as advertised on the menu. Tom reached for his wallet and realized he had a problem. He only had modern currency, credit cards, and identification from 2023. Tom pulled out a $20 bill to pay for his meal. The waitress looked at the bill with confusion. "I'm sorry, honey, but I don't think this is real money. The design is all wrong, and it says 2013 on it. Do you have anything else?" Tom looked at his $20 bill. To him, it appeared completely normal, but he could understand how currency from 2013 would look strange to someone who believed it was 1952. "I think I left my wallet in the car. Could I go get it?" "Of course, honey. Take your time." Tom left the diner and walked to his car in the parking lot. His modern vehicle looked completely out of place among the classic cars surrounding it. But what disturbed him most was that his car seemed to be fading, becoming less solid and visible, as if it was being rejected by the 1952 environment. Tom got in his car and tried to start the engine. It turned over normally, but when he looked around the parking lot, he could see that the other customers in the diner were now openly watching him through the windows. Their expressions had changed from subtle curiosity to obvious concern. As if his presence was disrupting something important, Tom decided to leave without paying for his meal, which violated his personal ethics but seemed necessary given the circumstances. He drove out of the parking lot and back onto Highway 20, expecting to quickly return to familiar modern surroundings. But as Tom drove away from Murphy's Family Restaurant, he found himself on a version of Highway 20 that corresponded to how the road would have looked in 1952. The pavement was different, the road signs were in an older style, and the landscape showed no evidence of development that had occurred in the decades since the 1950s. Tom drove for 20 minutes before the road began to transition back to its modern configuration. Gradually, the pavement improved, modern road signs appeared, and the landscape began showing evidence of contemporary development when Tom felt confident that he had returned to 2023. He pulled over and used his cell phone to search for information about Murphy's Family Restaurant. He found a local history website that included an article about the diner. Murphy's Family Restaurant had indeed opened in 1952 and had been a popular stop for travelers on Highway 20. But the diner had burned down in 1968, killing the owner and several customers who had been trapped inside. The site had never been rebuilt, and according to the article, it remained an empty lot. Tom drove back to where he thought the diner had been located, but found only an overgrown field with no signs of any structure having been there. There was no foundation, no parking lot, no evidence that a restaurant had ever existed at that location. Tom completed his drive to his parents' house, but he spent the entire next day researching the history of Murphy's Family Restaurant and the stretch of Highway 20 where he had stopped. He found newspaper accounts of the 1968 fire, photographs of the diner during its years of operation, and interviews with survivors who described the restaurant exactly as Tom had experienced it. He also found accounts from other travelers who had reported stopping at a 1950s diner in that area, despite the fact that no such establishment had existed there for over 50 years. All the accounts described the same experience: authentic 1950s atmosphere, period-appropriate customers, and the unsettling realization that they had somehow traveled backward in time. Tom never stopped at that location again, but he often wondered if Murphy's Family Restaurant was still serving dinner to travelers who needed a break from their journey, offering them a chance to experience a time when the pace of life was slower and the world seemed simpler. Tom began investigating other reports of temporal anomalies along rural highways in the Pacific Northwest. He found numerous accounts of travelers encountering businesses, towns, and landscapes that corresponded to earlier historical periods. Many of these encounters occurred along older highways that had been major travel routes for decades. Highway 20 through Oregon had particular significance in this regard. Built during the Great Depression as part of federal work projects, it had served as a lifeline for communities throughout central and eastern Oregon. The road had carried generations of travelers, farmers seeking markets, families pursuing opportunities, workers following seasonal employment, and had developed strong emotional associations with hope, perseverance, and the American dream of mobility and opportunity. Tom learned that Murphy's family restaurant had been more than just a business. It had served as a community gathering place, a refuge for travelers, and a symbol of hospitality during difficult economic times. The 1968 fire that destroyed the restaurant had been a significant loss for the entire region, eliminating not just a popular dining spot, but a landmark that represented continuity and tradition. The fact that Murphy's continued to serve travelers decades after its physical destruction suggested that some places become so important to human experience that they persist beyond their material existence. The restaurant existed in the memories and hearts of people who had found comfort there, and occasionally those memories became strong enough to break through into physical reality. Tom also discovered that the 1950s period that Murphy's represented had special significance for American culture. The decade following World War II was remembered as a time of optimism, community solidarity, and traditional values, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in contemporary society. For travelers stressed by modern life, an encounter with Murphy's might represent a return to simpler times, when human connections were more authentic and life moved at a more manageable pace. Tom eventually returned to that stretch of Highway 20, but during daylight hours and with a different perspective. He found the empty lot where Murphy's had once stood and spent time reflecting on the human stories that had unfolded there, the families who had shared meals, the travelers who had found refuge, the community members who had gathered for conversation and companionship. Tom came to understand that Murphy's family restaurant continued to exist because it represented something essential about human nature, the need for hospitality, community, and connection. These values transcend time and physical limitations, persisting in places where they have been deeply felt and genuinely practiced. Some places refuse to accept that their time has passed, and some restaurants continue serving customers long after their final meal should have been served. Because the human need for nourishment goes beyond food to include comfort, welcome, and the assurance that travelers are never truly alone on their journeys. Story 4. The Construction Zone. David Kim was driving from Portland, Oregon to his new job in Boise, Idaho, a 430-mile journey that he planned to complete in a single day. David had recently been offered a position with a technology company in Boise, and he was making the drive to apartment hunt and finalize his relocation plans. The route took him east on Interstate 84 through the Columbia River Gorge, across eastern Oregon and into Idaho. David was familiar with the first part of the journey, but he had never driven through eastern Oregon, and he was looking forward to seeing new landscape. On the afternoon of September 8th, David encountered a construction zone that challenged everything he thought he knew about highway maintenance and the nature of reality itself. David had been driving for about 4 hours and was somewhere in eastern Oregon when he encountered road signs indicating construction ahead. The signs were standard highway department warnings: road work ahead, reduce speed, be prepared to stop. David reduced his speed and prepared for the typical delays associated with highway construction. He had encountered similar work zones many times during his years of commuting in Portland, and he knew to expect reduced lanes, flaggers directing traffic, and construction vehicles moving slowly. As David approached the construction zone, he saw the familiar sight of orange cones, temporary barriers, and construction equipment. A flagger was stopping traffic to allow vehicles coming from the opposite direction to pass through a section where the highway had been. Reduced to a single lane, David waited in line with about 6 other vehicles while traffic from the opposite direction passed through the construction zone. The wait was longer than usual, about 15 minutes, but David assumed this was due to the remote location and the need to move large construction equipment safely. When the flagger finally signaled David's group to proceed, they began driving slowly through the construction zone. David could see construction workers operating heavy equipment, road grading machines preparing new pavement, and supervisors directing the work. The construction zone was extensive. David drove through it for about 20 minutes at reduced speed, following the vehicle ahead of him through a series of lane changes and temporary detours around construction activity. What struck David as unusual was the apparent age of the construction equipment and the clothing worn by the workers. The machines looked like construction equipment from the 1970s or 1980s, older models that he rarely saw in active use. The workers were wearing construction gear that also seemed dated, and their work methods appeared to use older techniques rather than modern road construction practices. David assumed he was observing a local construction company that used older equipment, possibly due to budget constraints in this rural area. But as he drove through the work zone, he began to notice other details that seemed strange. The construction workers were building a highway that already existed. David could see that they were grading and paving a roadway that appeared identical to the highway he was currently driving on. They seemed to be constructing Interstate 84 in exactly the same location where Interstate 84 already existed. David also noticed that the landscape around the construction zone didn't match the terrain he remembered from earlier in his journey. The hills and rock formations were different, the vegetation was different, and even the sky seemed to have a different quality of light. Most disturbing, when David looked back at the road behind him, he couldn't see the line of vehicles that had been following him through the construction zone. He appeared to be driving alone, despite having been part of a group of cars. When the flagger had allowed them to proceed, David tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps he had misunderstood the nature of the construction project. Perhaps the other vehicles had taken a different route through the work zone. Perhaps the lighting conditions were affecting his perception of the landscape. But as David continued driving through the construction zone, he began to encounter the same construction workers and equipment repeatedly. He would pass a road grader operated by a man in a yellow hard hat, drive for 10 minutes, and then pass what appeared to be the same road grader operated by the same man in the same location. David realized he was driving in a loop through the construction zone, repeatedly passing the same workers doing the same tasks in the same locations. But he was following a clearly marked route with orange cones and barriers. There was no opportunity to accidentally drive in circles. David decided to stop and ask one of the construction workers for directions. He pulled over near a group of workers who were installing guardrails and got out of his car. The workers appeared to be taking a break from their labor, sitting on equipment or standing in small groups discussing the day's progress. They were wearing work clothes that looked authentic to the early 1960s, denim overalls, flannel shirts, leather work boots, and hard hats that showed the wear and weathering of regular use. The workers themselves looked like men from that era. Their hairstyles, their mannerisms, their way of carrying themselves reflected the culture and social norms of the early 1960s. They were drinking coffee from metal thermoses, smoking cigarettes, and engaging in the kind of casual workplace conversation that characterized construction projects of that time. As David approached, the workers looked at him with curiosity but no hostility. They seemed puzzled by his modern clothing and general appearance, but they were willing to be helpful to what they perceived as a lost traveler. "Excuse me," David called to the nearest worker, a middle-aged man with graying hair and calloused hands that showed decades of manual labor. Could you tell me how much longer this construction zone continues? The worker set down his coffee thermos and walked over to where David was standing. He studied David's appearance carefully, taking note of his contemporary clothing, his modern hairstyle, and his general demeanor. Construction zone? Son, we're building this highway. It'll be ready for traffic in about 2 years if we can keep to schedule and the weather cooperates. David stared at the worker, trying to process what he was hearing. The man's response wasn't the answer of someone participating in a historical reenactment or tourist attraction. It was the genuine response of a construction worker who was actually building Interstate 84 for the first time. Building it? This is Interstate 84. It's already built. I've been driving on it all day. The worker looked around at the construction site, gesturing toward the heavy equipment, the graded roadway, and the crews working in various areas. Interstate 84? Never heard of it. We're building Highway 30 here. This is going to be the first modern highway through this part of Oregon, connecting Portland to the interior of the state. David checked the road signs visible from where he stood. They clearly displayed Interstate 84 exactly as they should, along with mile markers and directional information consistent with the modern highway system. But when he pointed these out to the construction worker, the worker seemed completely unable to see them. Son, there are no road signs here yet. We haven't gotten to that phase of construction. Right now we're just focused on getting the foundation laid and the roadway graded. The signs and final paving will come later. David was looking directly at Interstate 84 signs, mile markers, and direction indicators, but the construction worker appeared to see only an unmarked construction site. What year is it? David asked. 1962, the worker replied. We started this project last spring, and we should have traffic running by 1964 if the weather cooperates. David felt the world spinning around him. Interstate 84 had indeed been built through eastern Oregon in the early 1960s, but he was supposed to be driving on the completed highway in 2023. Not observing its construction 60 years earlier, David got back in his car and continued, driving through the construction zone. But now he understood that he was somehow witnessing the original construction of the highway he was traveling on. He was driving through a temporal overlap where past and present existed. Simultaneously, the construction workers were building the road that David was currently driving on. But they existed in 1962, while David existed in 2023. The construction zone was a place where these two time periods intersected, allowing David to observe the highway's construction while simultaneously using the completed highway. David drove through the construction zone for another hour, watching crews install the foundation, grade the roadway, and lay the pavement that would eventually become the modern Interstate 84. He saw the highway being built from the ground up by workers who had no idea they were being observed by a traveler from 60 years in the future. Gradually, the construction activity diminished, the temporal overlap faded, and David found himself driving on normal Interstate 84 in 2023. The construction workers and equipment disappeared. The orange cones and barriers faded away, and the landscape returned to its modern configuration. David pulled over at the next rest stop and researched the construction history of Interstate 84 through eastern Oregon. He found historical documents confirming that the highway had been built between 1960 and 1964, exactly as the construction worker had described. He also found newspaper archives with photographs of the construction process, and several of the workers shown in the photographs matched the faces of the men David had encountered in the temporal construction zone. David completed his drive to Boise, but he understood that certain places hold memories so strongly that past events continue to occur simultaneously with present reality. The construction of Interstate 84 had been such a significant undertaking that it left a permanent imprint on the landscape, creating a temporal echo that occasionally allows modern travelers to witness the highway's original construction. David began researching the broader implications of what he had experienced. He learned that Interstate 84 represented one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in Oregon history, transforming the state's transportation network and connecting previously isolated communities to national commerce and communication systems. The construction process had involved thousands of workers over several years, many of whom had dedicated significant portions of their lives to building the highway. For these workers, the project represented more than employment. It was a contribution to the future, a legacy that would benefit generations of travelers. David discovered that several of the workers who had built Interstate 84 had died during the construction process, victims of industrial accidents, equipment failures, and the hazardous conditions that characterized major construction projects of that era. These workers had literally given their lives to build the road that David and millions of other drivers now used routinely. The temporal construction zone that David had encountered might represent the continued presence of these dedicated workers, still committed to completing the project that had defined their final years. Their work ethic and determination had been so strong that it persisted beyond death, creating a parallel dimension where the highway's construction continued perpetually. David also learned that the route of Interstate 84 followed paths that had been significant for centuries before the modern highway was built. Native American trails, Oregon Trail segments, railroad corridors, and early automobile routes had all passed through the same geographic areas, creating layers of transportation history that accumulated over generations. Each of these transportation systems had represented hope for the people who used them. Native Americans following seasonal migration routes, pioneers seeking new opportunities in the West, railroad workers connecting distant communities, early automobile enthusiasts exploring the possibilities of motorized travel. The cumulative emotional energy of all these journeys had created a corridor where past and present transportation projects could coexist. David eventually took a position with the Idaho Department of Transportation, specializing in highway construction and maintenance. His experience with the temporal construction zone had given him a unique appreciation for the historical significance of highway infrastructure and the human dedication required to build and maintain transportation systems. David came to understand that highways are more than engineering projects. They are expressions of human determination to connect distant places, overcome geographic obstacles, and create infrastructure that will serve future generations. The workers who build these roads invest their skills, energy, and sometimes their lives in projects that will outlast them by decades or centuries. Some roads remember how they were built, and some construction projects never truly end. They continue forever in parallel dimensions where the work of connecting distant places remains as important today as it was 60 years ago, because the human need for connection and mobility is eternal.